父親を死に追いやってバカを見たで済ませるのか。死ね。殺す。こいつは殺さないとダメだ。
This video is going to be about all the reasons I feel make Death Note great. I'll also make a follow-up on why the second half of the series falls short, as I feel that's a topic that desperately needs to be addressed. However, I wanted to make this video first because I'm a huge fan of Death Note, and because while I do see a lot of people say they love the show, I haven't seen too many videos explaining why it's so well loved. Needless to say, this video will contain spoilers, so if you're at all interested in watching Death Note, I would highly recommend watching it first. Before I get started, it's necessary to provide an understanding of how I feel about this anime overall. I believe the best way to do that is to simply tell my story with Death Note. So back when I was just a lad in high school, I didn't have a lot of free time to watch TV or play games, because I was so busy with school and keeping up on my drawing. I remember I'd seen some clips of Death Note on YouTube, and they intrigued me enough that I started watching a spree of Death Note clips completely out of context, with no idea who the characters were or what was even going on. It's a pretty bad habit I have. It was so bad, for a while I thought L was the main character. Needless to say, I spoiled a lot for myself. Before I even considered watching, I already seen Naomi's death, L's death, and even Light's death. Like, I practically knew the end of every major character's story before I even know who they were or where their stories were going to go. Even so, I eventually committed to seeing Death Note, and when I did, I honestly thought it was the greatest work mankind had ever created. Every episode was ridiculously intense, packed full of crazy twists and mind-blowing scenarios. Not only that, but every episode ended with the worst cliffhangers. I can vividly recall how hard it was to only watch 1 or 2 episodes a night, just to go the whole next day at school wondering what was going to happen next. I think everybody can relate to this experience at some level, because we all have our own media we spend way too much time thinking about. But that's just my side of the story, not the story of Death Note. So for the sake of structuring this video, I'm going to break down what makes Death Note great into several categories. Their premise and pacing, art and music, and finally symbolism and direction. Yes, this may be an incredibly watered down approach to analysis, but in the case of keeping my explanation simple and clear, I think it'll just be fine. Now with that out of the way, I can finally dig deep into what makes Death Note such an appealing show, and what made it a cultural phenomenon ever since 2006. A lot of what goes into making something popular is marketability. So there's a bunch of popular methods for selling a new story to an unreached audience, such as using a studio or creator's name to establish its worth, comparing it to other popular works of a similar genre, and paying people in suits to say it's the greatest thing ever. However, I believe the most powerful and possibly genuine method is to simply sell an intriguing premise. Over the last few decades, only a relatively small number of anime have managed to become an international success, sometimes become even more popular outside of Japan. I want you to think of all the shows that have managed to do this, and really consider what it was that made them gather the attention that they did. For me, shows like Attack on Titan, One Punch Man, and Naruto all come to mind, just to name a few. So when taking a step back, it's incredibly easy to see what allowed them to gather their audience. The premise of each show is incredibly unique, as well as being open-ended enough so that it's difficult to know where the story is actually going before watching. Attack on Titan, for example, is a series about the last of humanity living in massive walls in an attempt to survive hordes of mindless naked giants, all set in the Middle Ages. Naruto is about a lonely kid aspiring to find his own path as a ninja in the world of ninjas and magic. One Punch Man is exactly what it sounds like. Perhaps I'm spending too much time on the topic. Basically, it's been repeatedly proven that a story's premise is what determines its success. That being said, Death Note arguably boasts one of the most interesting and marketable premises in all of anime. One telltale sign of an interesting concept is if it can be described effectively with only a few sentences. Let me say it like this. Death Note is the story about a schoolboy, bored with everyday life, who happens to come across a book that can kill anyone if their name is written in it. Just by hearing that last sentence, it wouldn't be very difficult to instantly come up with 20 or so ideas about how this story could go down. And that intrigue and possibility is what made Death Note such a success. I can say for myself that by the time the first episode ended, when Light introduced eliminating all crime to save the world, I knew this story was going to be one I would have to see until the very end. But that only covers the show's popularity, and not so much the quality of the show itself. The first and major aspect of Death Note that is immediately noticeable from the very first episode is just how incredibly airtight the pacing is. No time is wasted following a bored Light go about his ordinary day, Ryu gamble with the other Shinigami. We're not even given any expositionary dialogue. After only a single line shared between Light and Ryuk, Light finds the notebook and the fun everyone has tuned in to see begins. In the very second episode, L is introduced and the cat and mouse game that Death Note is known for begins. This show wastes almost zero time getting through all the setup. It moves so fast it skips traditional character introduction and develops them along the way instead. Now there's nothing wrong with stories that start slowly and meticulously build in action and excitement. Some of my favorite shows are like that. But in the case of Death Note, the entire story is one big race to the finish. As I stated earlier, every episode ends with a to be continued. Death Note is basically a race to the finish. It's a show that challenges its audience to keep up. Because of this, the creators rightly decided to cut to the chase instead of providing a standard beginning. In fact, it is because of its significantly slower pacing that the second season is not as highly regarded as the first. On a surface level, the art and character design looks like any other typical anime. In fact, there's really nothing distinct about the style humans are drawn in. However, where I would normally take away points for looking too homogeneous with anime as a whole, I consider it a benefit here. Consider the setting for a moment. Unlike a vast majority of shows, Death Note is set in the modern-day real world. This has the upside of being able to incorporate how countries, the media, and the populace react to the crazy events within the story, which in turn gives it a sense of realism. However, in order to look appropriate in the setting, the character designs needed to be toned down. All of the characters in Death Note look like they could be real people who exist in the real world. Not to go too far off topic, but the basic character designs also help with inviting new viewers who may not be used to the anime style. There's a plethora of shows I have heard are genuinely great, but I can't bring myself to watch simply because of their over-the-top bombastic art styles. There was a time after I'd finished watching Death Note where I was searching for something new, and I came across Code Geass. I had heard that it was similar to Death Note and the show shared a fan base. However, I only watched the opening before deciding it was something I did not want to see. Its art style was so aggressively anime that I couldn't take it seriously for 2 minutes. I did eventually watch Code Geass a few years later, and while I do think it's a great show, the ridiculous character art makes it difficult to be fully immersed in its world, if that makes sense. So even while the character designs aren't anything too special, the visuals for just about everything else is. Even though the only color you'll actually be seeing for the good majority of the time is gray, there's still so much wonderful lighting and atmosphere and depth to it that it looks beautiful regardless. In fact, the only times I can recall there being a normally colored scene is when Light dies at the very end. Because they're so used to seeing the dull, washed out colors, the bright orange sunset mixed with the deep blues and purples becomes instantly memorable. Though that's not to say the entire show is simply great. One visual style I adore in Death Note is how unafraid the creators were in occasionally bathing the entire image in reds and blues. In intense moments, the lighting and backgrounds disappear so that only a single character remains suspended in a void, saturated by their signature color. It's nothing too amazing, but it's a creative flair that really sets Death Note apart from the other standard shows. Take Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, for example. The animation and character art is always on point, but the visuals are always presented the same, so that watching it ends up as a stale experience with almost no impact, outside of the story of course. While on the topic of impactfulness, the music in Death Note is top-notch. I won't go on too long about it, but the music is the kind of stuff you actively look for outside of watching the show. My favorite tracks are Kiri with the choir chants, and the stimulating character themes for L, Light, and Nier. It's not too much of a stretch to say that Death Note easily has one of the best soundtracks in all of anime. The last and possibly most crucial aspect of what makes Death Note truly awesome is the visual imagery and symbolism that accompanies what would just be a good story without it. Not only does its abundant symbolism make rewatching Death Note a treat, as you're bound to pick up on things you missed on a first viewing, but it also gives the story a real sense of weight. When Light said for the first time that he was going to be a god, it easily could have been one of the corniest moments in the entire show, but due to the almost divine-esque presentation of Light acquiring and using his notebook, the moment has a feeling that Light really has elevated to something higher. It's clear that Death Note took its concept seriously, and pulled no punches in its delivery. A lot of modern media is afraid to present itself with the slightest amount of dignity, so it's refreshing to see the tone really fit well with the story. That's not to say Death Note doesn't pick on itself from time to time, as many memes can attest to, but the humor and parody is used appropriately and never too frequently. And finally, yes, of course, the direction is fantastic. What could have been unbearably boring stretches of dialogue are transformed into intriguing and intense moments when they almost have no right to be. Take a scene where Light picks up a pencil, for example. The action is abrupt and the camera always follows the movement. There's also this super satisfying snap to the animation, and it all comes together to make everyday generic motions super exciting to watch. It's because of this that L talking to two people on the phone at once is truly more epic than anything that takes place in 90% of the shows and movies I have seen in the last decade. The creators of Death Note understood that it wasn't about the scale of what was happening that made something truly awesome and hype, but the way it was presented. Every shot of action is sweeping and dramatic, the boarding is always dynamic and interesting to look at, and the cameraman is easily given the seizures. There's just so much to love here. The meme of Light eating a potato chip exists for a reason. I'm going to be honest, when I was writing the script for this video, I was intending on making a video explaining why the second half of Death Note falls short of the first, but after a page or so I scrapped it because I kept on remembering all the cool moments, and I couldn't get all the reasons I love the series out of my head. So while I do intend on making that video, it was definitely a better idea to do this one first. Expect more analysis videos on all sorts of things, and if you have any suggestions or requests you want to hear my thoughts on, just leave in the comments below.